Hello everyone, this is Tom in LA. Hope you're doing well. It's September the 6th today, 2021, and we're going to talk about Canto number 20 of Dante's Purgatorio, which is one of my favorite cantos because it's one of those cantos that don't get a lot of attention, and it's not really very talked about, but it's got so much beauty and intensity. So before jumping in, because it's fairly complex, so I'm going to try to be succinct, I have three introductory points. The first one is about avarice. We are still on the fifth terrace, the Terrace of Avarice and Prodigality, and we remember leaving the end of Canto 19, the Pope Adrian V, in a very melancholic, almost moving scene. Here again, the purview of avarice is broader than simply being greedy about money, and so it includes also glory and power, etc. In the previous canto, Dante was focusing on Adrian V and therefore the highest rung of the, let's say, ecclesiastical ladder. In this one, in Canto 20, we are looking at the highest rung of the secular power. Dante is really focusing and taking aim at the entire French ruling dynasty, which is seen by Dante almost as an incarnation of the she-wolf, the famous she-wolf that we've seen in Canto number 1 of Inferno. In addition, the French dynasty has been subservient to the church and has built this unholy alliance, let's say, bringing a lot of more temporal power to the church in a way that Dante despised. In fact, for Dante, this type of alliance was almost the work of the devil, and it's not a coincidence that Philip the Fair of the French dynasty is gonna be shown, we're gonna find him in Purgatorio number 32, Canto 32, just next to this allegory of the church that is a prostitute. The second point is that there is a slight change in structure in the way Dante handles the terraces of Purgatorio from now on, and especially the fifth terrace. So far, and this is actually something that I can represent with an image taken from the Digital Dante website that's curated by Teodolinda Barolini, the Dante scholar. The slight difference is in the fact that so far we've seen the examples of virtue, we've seen the souls, and then we've seen the examples of vice and the angel, etc. Here, Dante gives a bit more space to the souls and their background history. Then we have the examples of the virtue, poverty and generosity. Then the encounter with the king, Hugh Capet. And then the examples of avarice. And finally, the encounter with a third soul while we are still on the fifth terrace. Point number 3, we need to remember that this 20th canto is the last canto in Purgatorio where Dante talks about politics and repeats and kind of goes deeper into his very dear themes of the two sons, emperor, empire, and church, and kind of draws, but it's almost like a summary in this Canto 20th of how Italy, how the world for Dante, because he's talking about all of Europe really, got to the point of quasi-disaster where it is today. So it does make sense that Dante stops talking about politics after avarice, because gluttony and lust have traditionally been considered more in the private sphere of the individual sinner, while avarice, while yes, individual and private, is a sin that has a lot of ripple effects on society and on the wider social group. So this is why Dante still talks about politics in this particular terrace. So let's start reading Canto 20 in the Mandelbaum translation. Against the better will, the will fights weakly. Therefore, against my pleasure, to please him, I drew my unquenched sponge out of the water. Dante is clearly still thirsty of knowledge and information from Adrian V, but he's also being mindful here. He's being mindful of what Adrian wants to do, which is go back to purifying himself. And so there is a certain sense of maturity and altruism in the fact that Dante keeps his unquenched sponge from insisting with more questions with Adrian, and decides to move on. I moved on, and my guide moved through the unencumbered space, hugging the rock. Then here from verse number 10, we have two tercets that are probably the most important tercets of the entire canto, if not some of the most important tercets. May you be damned, O ancient wolf, whose power can claim more prey than all the other beasts. If we remember in Inferno, in the circle of the greedy, Dante already had told us that the number of souls who are rotting in Inferno in that circle is bigger than anywhere else. So it takes again that concept, and of course the ancient wolf is the she-wolf that in Canto number 1 of Inferno we're still not 100% sure what exactly represented, and here we are completely sure that it represents a composite of all these vices and negative desires that rotate around the concept of cupiditas. So in other words, more or less what we've seen in the old witch of the previous canto. This is also demonstrated by the fact that Dante uses the word antica or ancient to define this wolf, this she-wolf, and Virgil in the previous canto has used antica to define the witch. So there is a very close link here between the she-wolf and the witch. And in this short invective, Dante is giving us the impression that avarice is the worst sin of all the sins. And in a certain sense, we can say that it is, because from a theological point of view, if we look at St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, pride is really what is at the root of all sins. This is why it's the base of purgatory. But avarice and cupiditas in the ancient theology was where all the evil in the world comes from. So from a, let's say, purely theological point of view, the worst sin in front of God is that of pride, because it's the sin of Lucifer, to being prideful against God. But the sin that produces the worst damages in our earthly world is really avarice, in the broader sense of thirst and hunger of glory, power, and earthly goods. In the second tercet here, Dante is talking directly to God. He's saying, "O heavens, through whose revolutions many things on earth are changed, when will he come, the one whose works will drive their wolf away?" Once again, we are made to think about Canto number 1, where Dante talked about this prophecy, the only real prophecy in the Divine Comedy that Dante refers to his own future, where he was talking about this hound. The hound will come and will set things right in Italy from a political standpoint. And we've never really known if this hound was an emperor or a particularly righteous pope. But most likely, this veltro or hound, in Dante's mind, was an emperor. Somebody who, like Henry VII, later on, potentially, will be coming down to Italy and express and impress his power on the peninsula that so far has been almost abandoned to whoever has a residual power, including the church. Virgil and Dante are walking forward, looking at all these souls who are still laying down with their belly on the floor, on the ground. And they hear one voice, one particular voice, that starts the examples of the virtue, which is the virtue that really opposes and contrasts the vice of avarice. And as always, the first example comes from Mary. So what they hear is, "Sweet Mary, as a woman would outcry in labor pains. In that hostel where you had set down your holy burden, there one can discover just how poor you were." This is a reference to the stall where Mary and Joseph settled without having found other more decent places, and where Jesus was born. So the virtue that Dante is referring to here is a generosity of spirit in one sense, but also mixed with poverty, and poverty meant as a spiritual detachment from richness. The second example of virtue that's being declaimed by the same voice is Caius Fabricius. Caius Fabricius. He is a consul who actually lived in Rome and reigned as consul between 282 and 278 BC. He was in general admired for his frugality as a person, as a personality, and also he received a lot of offers of bribes from his enemies, and came to history as somebody who was very strong in character and refused to accept any of those bribes. And the third example of virtue here is Saint Nicholas. Saint Nicholas is the famous patron of Christmas. His gift-giving actions made him become in history the patron of Christmas. He was a bishop in Asia Minor who lived in the 4th century, and aside from many other stories and behaviors that are ascribed to him, to his biography, he had an impoverished friend. This was a noble friend who had fallen from grace and had no money anymore. He couldn't sustain himself, and he couldn't sustain his family and his daughters. His 3 daughters, for some reason, at some point, this friend was almost to the brink of having to sell them out to prostitution to sustain not only himself but also themselves, the daughter. He had nothing left, and Saint Nicholas came to rescue, bringing enough gold for all of them to really avoid the situation and being able to survive for a long time until their financial situation was restored. After hearing these beautiful prayers and statements, Dante asks the soul if it's possible to talk, to have a discussion and find out who the soul is and what's happening exactly on this terrace. And he starts speaking. I was the root of the obnoxious plant that overshadows all the Christian lands, so that fine fruit can rarely rise from them. This is Hugh Capet, the king of the Franks from 987 to 996. He was elected as successor of the last Carolingian king, so he is considered by Dante to be the first founder of the house of the Capetians. He's saying, but if Douai and Lille and Bruges and Ghent had power, then they'd soon take vengeance on it, and this I beg of him who judges all. He's already said 2 very important things here. First, he said that he recognizes that his descendants didn't take any virtue from him, but there was a degeneration in virtue, and therefore they've become like a dark plant over the world of Christianity. Dante uses the word adugia, la terra cristiana tutta adugia, this terrible plant. Adugia means to cover with a shade, but also inducing sadness and melancholy. So you can visualize it as a long shadow covering all of Christianity because of this French dynasty. The second part, the second text that I just read about the Flanders, these 4 cities were the main 4 cities in the Flanders, refers to the fact that it's a prophecy that Hugh Capet is giving to Dante here in 1300 in the fiction, because in 1299 Philip the Fair betrayed the Flanders after pretending to aggrieve them to agree to give them their freedom. There was a betrayal really from Philip IV, who was one of the descendants of Hugh Capet. After 1300, after the moment in the fiction of the Divine Comedy, 2 years later in 1302, the Flanders in fact defeated the French in a battle. It doesn't matter that things then evolved, there was more battles, the French were defeated, the Flanders were defeated again, but Dante is painting a sort of vengeance that the Flanders took on the French, and that actually happened a couple of years after the moment of the fiction. The name I bore beyond was Hugh Capet. Of me were born the Louises and Philips, by whom France has been ruled most recently. I was the son of a Parisian butcher. This has been proved to be not true. It's just something that Dante thought, many of his contemporaries thought, but it was a French legend. And we can see this as Dante buying into a certain Ghibelline propaganda that had been circulating these rumors about Hugh Capet coming from a father who was a butcher. In fact, his family was a noble family already. We know that now because of documents and proven history. When all the line of ancient kings was done and only one, a monk in grey, survived, I found the reins, etc. Here, it's another example of how the sources that Dante had were not really accurate and precise. He didn't have solid sources in general for that type of history, but in any case, the last Carolingian king, coming from the house of Charlemagne, was Louis V, who reigned until 987. After that, Hugh Capet could take the power, and his house, the house of the Capetians, started. Now from here, Dante starts describing a history that really revolves around the French dynasty that becomes more and more degenerate from a virtue standpoint. Every king, every Charles that he will talk about, or Carlo, commits acts that are worse than the other, until the worst of the worst, who will be Philip IV, that, as I already mentioned, we will find in Purgatorio 32 next to the prostitute. We can say that between verse 67 and verse 92, Dante is presenting four main kings of the French dynasty and a lot of history in a very condensed way. The first one is Charles I, or Charles I of Anjou. Dante says Charles came to Italy and for amends made Conradin a victim and then thrust back Thomas into heaven. There is a little bit of confusion because there was a legend, and again it's a rumor that's been proven false, that Charles Anjou actually had St. Thomas Aquinas killed or poisoned, and that is not true. That's not true. But the fact that Charles Anjou had Conradin killed, that is actually true. Conradin was the legitimate heir to Frederick II, and Frederick II, remember, was the last really example of imperial power in Italy. So what happened is Charles Anjou was called by the Pope to take over the Kingdom of Sicily after Manfred, who was a son of Frederick II, took the throne of Sicily, but usurping it because he should have gone to Conradin. Manfred, just shortly after, died in a battle, but who Charles killed was Conradin, and this death was, or murder, let's say, was deemed by the commentators of the time, the contemporary commentators, to be completely unnecessary, especially for the young age of Conradin. I think he was 16 or 17, and for the fact that he was brutal. Charles asked for the decapitation of Conradin. While writing this monologue by Hugh Capet, Dante uses the word amenda 3 times in only 5 or 6 lines. This amends, amenda, amenda, amenda. And he's clearly using irony, because every French king's behavior is done to make amends of the previous behavior, while in fact, in reality, is even worse. So he's being sarcastic, he's being ironic here. I see a time, not too far off, and this is the second prophecy by Hugh Capet, in which another Charles advances out of France to make himself and his descendants famous. He is now referring to another Charles, Charles de Valois. He will actually take Florence in 1301 on behalf of an alliance between Boniface VIII, between the royals of France and the Black Guelphs, the Donati. We understand already at this point why this is so important and crucial and life-changing for Dante. exactly in the same months when Charles de Valois arrived in Florence, Dante happened to be in Rome. He was part of a delegation that had been sent to Rome to talk to Pope Boniface VIII, to petition the Pope to avoid this descent of Charles de Valois into Florence. Boniface, of course, didn't listen to this because he was part of this, let's call it conspiracy or alliance. And not only Dante was exiled, but there was a betrayal because Charles de Valois promised Florence to conserve the peace and to not change a lot and to be a good, let's say, leader of the town. But the opposite happened. He gave full free reins to the Black Guelphs, who unleashed their fury on the White Guelphs, destroying all of their houses, their wealth, their richness, and with unnecessary violence and unnecessary reactions. As part of this process, Dante, as a White Guelph, was exiled from Florence. And this is exactly what the verses are saying. Verse 73, he does not carry weapons when he comes, because he was counting on the pontifical troops and army, the Pope's army, and also on the Black Guelphs. So he didn't need to carry weapons, but only the lance that Judas tilted, only the betrayal. That's the betrayal that I just mentioned. This he couches so, he twists the paunch of Florence. In other words, he opened up and revealed all the rotten there was in Florence, giving free rein to the Black Guelph and allowing all this pent-up violence that was there to explode, and it was a disaster. And Dante concludes the episode of Charles de Valois reminding us that from this he will gain not land, just shame and sin, which will be all the heavier for him as he would reckon lightly such disgrace, because his mission was purely and simply to gain more power and more lands. But his mission over Sicily failed. So the kingdom of Sicily did not end up in his hands. The other, who is Charles II of Anjou, and so we are now talking about the third of these kings. And Dante is really giving us almost 3 centuries or 4 centuries of French expansionism in this little concise portion. The other, Charles II of Anjou, who once left his ship as prisoner, I see him sell his daughter, bargaining as pirates haggle over female slaves. We are going worse and worse from a personality standpoint. We're getting from a worse person to one who's even worse than his father and his ancestor. Charles II of Anjou had always supported Boniface VIII and had always supported the Guelphs, in particular the Black Guelphs, against the empire. So it's true that he actually sold his daughter to a nobleman for a lot of money in 1305. So this quote here, I see him sell his daughter bargaining as pirates, it's something that was known, and Dante quotes not from simply a rumor, but a historical fact. My house is now your captive. It traffics in the flesh of its own children. What more is left for you to do to us? There is maybe a slight irony here because, in fact, there is worse coming, and he will describe it in the next verses. That past and future evil may seem less, I see the fleur-de-lis enter Anagni, and in his vicar, Christ made prisoner. L'oltraggio di Anagni, we call it in Italian, the offense of Anagni, an episode where Philip IV, and we're now talking about the fourth king, Philip IV the Fair, he wanted to tax the clergy, and Boniface VIII was against that, so he reacted by excommunicating Philip IV. So this relationship between Philip IV and Boniface VIII would make for an incredibly interesting historical novel, because they were both incredibly strong personalities in their own space, until they crashed against each other, and unfortunately for Boniface VIII, Philip IV prevailed in the end. There are in fact 2 huge crimes that Dante is imputing to Philip IV here. The first one is at verse 85 and 86. I see the fleur-de-lis. The fleur-de-lis was the insignia, the symbol of the King of France. Enter Anagni, and in his vicar, Christ made prisoner. In other words, Boniface VIII was residing in Anagni which is a small town in Lazio, not too far from Rome. And the king's Philip IV emissaries arrived in Anagni with soldiers. They were emissaries, and one of these two emissaries, in fact, was part of a family who were archenemies of Boniface VIII. They really hated him, and these were the Colonna family. So Philip IV, by sending somebody from the Colonna family to Boniface VIII, knew that this was going to be big trouble for Boniface VIII and didn't do anything about it. So it was almost as if he directly wanted to hurt Boniface VIII. In fact, soldiers entered in Anagni. They physically assaulted the Pope. This was unprecedented almost. The Pope was already an elderly man, and they imprisoned him in his own palace, which they sacked. Boniface later on, a little bit later, was freed and taken to Rome, but probably the psychological shock and the physical hurt and shock and wounds that he had suffered led to his death only a month later. So it's true, and it's really accurate to say that because of Philip IV, Boniface VIII was killed. We know that Dante hated Boniface VIII. Boniface VIII had caused a lot of grief and problems and troubles to Dante's life, but he was the head of the church, and Dante still had respect for him. This attack from Philip IV was really an attack to the mystical body of Christ, that is the church. Dante never wavered in his respect for the church as an institution. Even if he was criticizing it in a very fierce way, that never changed for him. This behavior of Philip IV of pretending to be detached but really causing the capitulation of Boniface VIII deserves his being called Pilate, the new Pilate, by Dante. And this is his second crime that Dante talks about here. At verse 91 he says, "And I see the new Pilate, Philip IV, one so cruel that, still not sated, he, without decree, carries his greedy sails into the temple." What is Dante referring to here? He's referring to an accusation of heresy that in 1307 Philip IV brought against the Templars, the Knight Templars, this movement of knights, a very wealthy group of people. He accused them of heresy, he arrested them, he tortured them, and he actually burned their Grand Master alive. All this not because of specific political reasons, but mainly because he wanted to put his hands on their wealth, on their riches, and also because he was in great debt towards them. He had some debts with the Templars. So he wanted to get the possessions, their immense wealth, and these huge debts, he basically never paid them back, not before destroying the order and not after. So those debts were never paid back. In 1312, so 5 years later, Philip IV convinced the next Pope, Pope Clemens V, to officially suppress the Order of the Templars once and for all. This is the second crime that Philip IV committed. At verse 97, Hugh Capet answers very briefly the second question by Dante, and he says, "What I've said about the only bride the Holy Ghost has known, about Mary, the words that made you turn me for commentary, these words serve as answer to your prayers, as long as it is day. But when night falls, then we recite examples that are contrary, examples of the vice of avarice. Then we tell over how," and here we have a list of 8 characters, some from mythology, some from biblical, some from scripture, and all of these 8 characters are examples of avarice, intended as pure greed, or a little bit broader, in the broader sense of avarice. Pygmalion, it comes from the Aeneid, and he was the brother of Dido. He killed her husband, who was very wealthy, Sychaeus, who then appeared in a dream to Dido and revealed to her everything that had happened. So Dido ran away with the wealth. The second one is Midas from Ovid. We all know the Midas touch. There was something that the god Bacchus gave to Midas, the gift of transforming into gold everything that he touched, to the point of not being able to drink or eat because everything was turning into gold. And secondarily, there is another story that Apollo gave to Midas the ears of a donkey, almost like in Pinocchio. Maybe Collodi took that from Ovid, this type of transformation. The third character is Achan, from the seventh book of Joshua. Achan stole the treasure of the Israelites, and he was stoned to death by Joshua and his army. Then the fourth and fifth are Sapphira and her husband Ananias, who are also biblical characters, and they sold part of their lands to make some money to give to the church. However, they actually kept a significant part of their money for themselves. And when Peter, because this is actually from the Acts of the Apostles, when Saint Peter found out about this lie, for the big shame they both felt, they died of shame. The sixth one is Heliodorus, from the book of Maccabees in the Bible. He was the treasurer of the king of Syria, and he was assaulted while he was trying to take the treasure of the temple in Jerusalem, as the king of Syria had asked him to do. And so Dante is saying, we praise the kicks that Heliodorus suffered. We are happy that he was assaulted, because he was trying to commit this crime of, in the Israelites' view, of stealing the treasure from Jerusalem. The seventh example is Polymnestor, who killed Polydorus for the gold of Troy. And the eighth one is actually Krasus. He was a very high-level politician in the empire. In 60 BC, was one of the triumvirs. He was a triumvir together with Caesar and Pompey. He was killed in war, and the Parthian king Orodes, after having killed him, he had his head chopped off. He decapitated him, and in front of all of his court, he filled his mouth with molten gold. There is a famous sentence that King Orodes is said to have pronounced then, which is, "You thirst for gold and now drink it." Very cruel, but very apt for this to conclude this list of avaricious people. Without further ado, Virgil and Dante walk away, and all of a sudden we have a couple of miraculous events, incredible events here. We have a huge earthquake that shakes the entire mountain of Purgatorio, and at the same time, or right after, Dante and Virgil hear all the souls in this fifth terrace scream Gloria in excelsis Deo, which is this prayer that the angels sang at the birth of Jesus. Dante is very confused. He doesn't know what's happening. He's really confused, and he is pained by the ignorance of what's going on. But really, we will find out in the next canto that this Gloria in excelsis Deo is a prayer to celebrate the soul of somebody who has finished his purification process in Purgatory and is ready to move up and go to Paradiso and to go to heaven. And this soul is Statius. We're gonna find him in the next canto, the famous poet Statius. So the third soul that we're gonna find on this fifth terrace. The 20th canto ends in a very mysterious and confused mood, which is exactly what Dante is feeling right now, because he doesn't know why this earthquake came, and he doesn't know why all the souls shouted this particular prayer all of a sudden. But really, this shout is a sign or a symbol that links the birth of Jesus with the kind of rebirth of Statius, because the soul, any soul, once it's completed the purgation or the purification process, is almost as if it was reborn and be ready to go to Paradiso, to heaven. A complex canto full of history and politics, but we also can understand why all this history and this politics were so important to Dante, and why they are so crucial to the Divine Comedy, because this situation in Italy with the lack of power, of the imperial power, and the church taking over this power in some way, even if certainly not in a good way, has been affecting Dante, has been affecting all the towns of Italy, and is at the heart of Dante's political meditations. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks for your support. I look forward to move on to Canto 21.